Thank you for the good work. I'm Regina Kapinga. I'm from Tanzania. It is good to hear about all these success stories. And my question is on the communicating of the results. I was wondering, when you go to different countries, whom do you communicate these results to? Because it has a lot on decision making. If you talk to scientists, yes, they will agree and everything will be okay, but they can't make a decision on how to engage better, more especially for the large-scale impacts. So I was wondering whether you are making some efforts to meet the government officials, more especially the decision makers, who can decide on the portfolio on how much can be can go into funding such.
Deanna Grzinski, I'm on the agricultural development team. I work with Prabhu. And early on, I started some of the gender work, which Haven Lai has now taken over. My question for you is, if we were to do this million fed, 10, 15 years from now, with a renewed emphasis on gender and doing it right, how would that change your report? Because I felt that in the analysis, we were focusing on success, and I understand that message. But I kept wondering, I'm like, would it have been tens of millions fed if those programs had a better gender focus, or hundreds of millions fed? So
let me touch on both questions, and they're excellent queries for us. Reaching out to an audience beyond scientists or beyond people who can't really make decisions about, say, allocating public resources to agricultural development is very important. I think one of the reasons why this project has been so effective is that IFPRI certainly understands exactly the point you're talking about, that having a good communication strategy to reach decision makers, to reach policy makers, is incredibly necessary. And I'll give you an illustration of how this worked. When we presented in Washington and London, we had a great audience of people from USAID, the World Bank, DFID in London, and lots of other universities and such. And their questions are, what's on the global agenda for agricultural development? How much is the G8 giving? Where's the money coming from? Those types of things. Sort of high-level questions, if you ask me. But when we presented in Addis Ababa with the Africa Union and the UN Economic Commission for Africa as our co-hosts, and with the Minister of Agriculture and Rural Development from Ethiopia as a panel member, we got down to the heart of the issue there. How do you implement success? How do you make it happen? And the entire audience, as well as the entire panel, really got embroiled in that issue. How do you make these things happen? How do they happen on the ground? It's not a matter of, big G8 summits. It's a matter of, what goes on the ground? And I think a lot of your grantees and a lot of you in the foundation struggle with these very issues. So in a sense, that's how we were getting out to decision makers and policy makers. And I'll let Rajul add to that. Joe, want me to? The gender issue, is something that we considered from the very beginning, because the gender pathways to reducing hunger and reducing malnutrition are a very important aspect of understanding how agricultural development works. Each case study, to the extent possible, touches on some of those gender issues. So, for instance, if you look at the study on the in-depth study, the discussion paper on household responsibility system and land tenure reform in China, there's an entire section on the gendered impacts of that land tenure reform process, which were in many ways negative because women lost out in the transfer and inheritance of property, or in cases of divorce and things like that. And land is a productive asset. When women lose out on ownership of productive assets, there are very serious impacts on general welfare. But having said that, when we consulted a lot with our colleagues who specifically work on gendered issues in IFPRI, one of the real missing elements is good, rigorous impact evaluation material on the gendered impacts of different types of interventions. I'm not saying it's not there, it's just that literature is actually quite thin. There aren't many success stories out there that have a real, gender component to them to say, this really worked for women and it really worked for, changing the roles of women and men in society, and therefore on, say, agricultural productivity or hunger or malnutrition. Which doesn't mean that it's not there. It just means that a lot more investment needs to go into evaluating those impacts, the gendered impacts of interventions in agricultural development. And I know that the Gates Foundation, among other donors, puts a lot of emphasis on that in their work. And it's something that, 10 years down the line, as you say, I think we'll have a lot more evidence that needs to be corralled and published and shared.
Let me just follow up on the comment you made, which is very valuable. In addition to directly reaching policymakers, and we do that through the events, we do that through the mailings, we do that through one-on-one communications, it's very important to reach the media, because we also have to find what are people reading, what are they influenced by. So we invest quite a lot at IFPRI because it's not just directly reaching, it's also reaching who are different agents of change in different communities. Sometimes in some countries it is donor agencies that are putting more weight. So I think that it does require a little bit of calibration country by country. We invest a lot in that. We look at civil society organizations, we look at media, and so forth. But you're very right, we have to look at the different actors who will basically bring about our desire for action and change. Can I pick up on Diana's point? Because I was very intrigued. If we were going to do this study 10, 15 years down the road, what would we find? I would hope that we'd find two things, besides the gender work that David mentioned and you mentioned. I would hope that we'd find more successes in the latter part of the pathways of success that David presented, and that is on nutrition. We really were struck by basically that we only have one success in this book out of the 20 that was a nutrition-related success. And part of that, I think, is because of impact evaluations. Part of that is because we are only, in recent years, have been making large-scale interventions on nutrition that are accessible and documented. But to me, looking down the road, I would hope that we are finding ways to also generate successes that go all the way to nutrition and have an impact there. The other thing I hope that we will find was that we struggled with the indicators for this, and food security indicators. We struggled even more with indicators on nutrition. So it's not necessarily that they're nutrition interventions, but even interventions that are able to show the nutrition outcomes. We struggled tremendously with that because a food security outcome is not necessarily a nutrition outcome. And I hope that we are able to improve our means for also assessing the nutrition outcomes and are able to expand our millions fed to millions nourished or something. But I think that I would hope to be able to see down the road that we're making those.
I'm Marlene Mitchell with the Markets Access Group, and I know one of the guys involved with the greening of the Sahel, and I know what it's taken to keep that project alive. And I also know that donors tend to think pretty short term in many cases, and these have been fairly sustained efforts in each of the cases that you gave. What did you learn about that issue of sustained effort and what it takes, the persistence? Is that the part of the success factor, or is it just the other items that you listed?
Okay, let's take a couple more questions. Maybe I can ask a question. Since you've looked at over, 250 cases, right? And you've selected 20 cases out of the 200 or so. Now, within those 200, did you find that there were some factors that prevented those cases from becoming true successes? Were there some quintessential factors that you said, if these were in place, some of these from the 200 would have made it to the true success cases? That's one question. The other question is, how does this work change IFPRI itself? Is Rajul, since you're the senior advisor to the Director General, what would you tell the Director General after going through this work to say, as we look ahead over the next 10 years of IFPRI's agenda, this is how we should redo it, reshape it. Let's see, any other questions before we, yeah, go ahead.
We talk a lot about, sorry, oh, good microphone. We talked a lot about results, obviously, measurement of results. Two things. One, kind of curious how you have sort of what you've put in place for results of the book and the effort, the communication effort, and how you've started tracking your own success of the book, of going out. And also, it seems like there's a big message about, you know, you said you only chose groups that did measure. So there's sort of a message going about measure, 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 measure. And I'm kind of curious if you ever get pushback on that based on the cost and the overhead of doing that work from smaller organizations.
Let me address Arlene's point about sustained investment, sustained effort, whether it's the Sahel, this regreening of the Sahel, or any other sort of success story here. I mean, absolutely, the point you make is well understood, and it's a shame that so many donors are so, you know, short-term in their thinking. Sustained investment in technology, in policy reform, in market development, all of these things, you know, require a long-term commitment. And certainly, you know, you've seen it in agricultural development and agricultural funding for agricultural research, especially. You know, the donors have just sort of lost interest in it during the 1980s. And then if you look at sub-Saharan Africa, I mean, in some countries, you know, the real value of funding for agricultural research actually declined in the 80s. You had fewer breeders, you had fewer breeding programs, you had fewer, you know, national research organizations being able to do anything. So obviously, sustained investment in science and technology, sustained investment in infrastructure development, market development, and all of these things is absolutely essential. How do you convince the donors not to be, you know, short-minded about it or short-terming about it? I don't know. Change the whole political process, I guess. That's something to think about. Let me just leave it at that.
Well, let me pick up on your questions first. Your first one was, were there factors that held back some of these potential successes that were in the 250 or so? We didn't look at the failures, and we didn't look at all of these successes, or rather nominations. What I think the key point to note over here is scaling up. And that was one of the key points that came through to me, that there are a number of pilot successes or small-scale successes. And if in a moment of lunacy I was going to do more work on this, I would actually want to do on scaling up. Because I think learning why certain things are effectively scaled up and why others are not is, I think, a very major lesson for us to learn. We are all great at starting off projects. But when can we scale up? Why do certain things, what makes certain projects be effectively scaled up or sustainably scaled up? And are sure their success is not something we have a handle on. I did look around to see who is working on these issues on scaling up, and there are not that many people working on them. The projects we had here were those that were at scale, but we didn't look at what the successes that didn't actually translate into scale up. That's an area, I think, of further work. Let me come back to the question on the tracking of successes, and I'll come back to your last question. If I understood you correctly, how are we tracking the successes of these successes? We have a number of instruments in place and a number of tracking modalities. Obviously, simple ones are participation in the launches, who came, who participated, how many, where did we disseminate the booklets and the books and the various products, what were the brand hits, what were the media hits, which media outlets carried us, where are the different people coming into our website, we traced down, looked there. The number of ways in which we have, and we have prepared reports which we'll share with Ellen and Gates at appropriate intervals for people to keep track. What we realized is that this project is different from most other projects at IFPRI, particularly the projects on hot issues, where you have a very rapid uptake and then a very rapid downtake, because only that many times you will say how many people are going to visit here or the like. This is a project where we are seeing uptake like this. And we expect it will continue like that for a while and plateau, and that the down peak will probably be a year or 2 years down the road still, We are seeing a very different pattern over here. We are seeing more and more demand coming in. I should tell you that we are already in the third printing of our booklet and the second printing of our book. We had not expected that much demand that fast. We had planned for reprinting 6 months down the road. We did the first reprinting of the booklet within 3 weeks. And we're now already disseminated more than 5,000, which was way beyond our planning because we expected much more uptake to electronic means. Last point, what would I advise the Director General, what are some of the lessons coming out of this work for IFPRI? Several things, and I have to tell you I've not given as much careful thought, but several things come out to me from this particular work. One we've already harped on quite a bit is the importance of impact assessments, impact evaluations, and how IFPRI can play a role there, both in communicating and undertaking. But I think also looking the importance of nutrition is something that I think would come out very strongly. The importance of agriculture, nutrition, health linkages is something that comes out strongly to me from this work. The importance of facilitating partnerships. What makes effective partnerships? You know, how do you foster partnerships? Because we saw one of the key ingredients for success was partnerships. Partnerships don't happen because we say, let's partner together. There are certain factors. What makes certain partnerships viable? What can we do through policy means? The scaling up work that I mentioned earlier, that to me would be a very major area of work that I would like to see us going into. You know, because at the end of the day, we can have isolated small successes, but where are we going to make, as Diana's point says, the tens and the hundreds and the billions of people? You know, so what makes effective scaling up? Those are among some of the key lessons I'll take away from here. But I think there are very many other lessons that do come out. How do you create space for experimentation at a time, as David mentioned, where there is a desire for rapid showing of impact? And yet the role of experimentation is a very important role. What can a research institute offer in that policy space of allowing for experimentation and trial and learning, and the role of research, per se, in that? Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was really great. From our side, definitely the issue of scaling up is something we really take to heart as we design projects and grants. And what Arlene brought up is really crucial for our work. We really look at long-term sustained commitment, and we ask ourselves as we go into each of our grants, is this grant going to have sustained funding, sustained support over the long term for it to be successful and for it to be scaled up. We're running out of time, so I don't think we're going to have any more chance for another round of questions, but if there's one really burning question, please let me know. Did you have a burning question? Good. Then in that case, I have the pleasant task of congratulating Rajul, David, and the team for an excellent product. Congratulating IFPRI for doing this work, and we hope that the Millions Fed will continue to be a living activity within IFPRI, and we'll continue to see new cases being added to the list. We hope that you'll have a website which you'll keep active. You know, we keep getting letters all the time asking us, well, how come our case is not part of your list? So maybe there should be a way in which you can look at cases as they come up. And we certainly would encourage you to keep working in this field. Thank you so much.